Welcome to Breaking Down the Buzz, the podcast where we explore the thrilling world of tech industry leaders. From AI to the latest trends, we cut through the noise and decode the tech buzz and share our collected insights and insider knowledge. Welcome to Breaking Down the Buzz, where we peel back the layers of hype to reveal the true innovators shaping our digital world. Our guest today is Bryce Johnson, a trailblazer in the field of accessible technology. As the co-inventor of the Xbox Adaptive Controller and a principal researcher in accessibility and inclusive design at Microsoft, Bryce's journey from designing digital libraries for the visually impaired in Canada to spearheading groundbreaking projects at Microsoft showcases a relentless pursuit of a more accessible digital world for everyone. Bryce's story is not just about technology, it's about challenging our perceptions, pushing the boundaries of traditional design, and fostering a more inclusive society through thoughtful innovation. Welcome, Bryce, to Breaking Down the Buzz.
Thank you for joining us, Bryce. I'm super excited to have you. It's great to talk to you. We haven't spoken in quite a while.
So, yeah. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to dig in with you because I meet a lot of really interesting people in my travels, for sure. And you are one of the most interesting people that I have met along my travels. We met, I'm on the board of a nonprofit called SOAR 365, which focuses on providing employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities. And so we met, pre-COVID, I would say, to talk about, what we could be doing with SOAR 365 around inclusivity and technology. So, when I put this podcast together, you were one of the first people that I thought of because, again, such interesting work that you do. So if you could tell us a little bit about your background and, how you ended up at Microsoft and doing what you do, that would be great.
Yeah. I started, I'm in Seattle, around the Seattle area right now because I work at Microsoft, but I'm from Toronto, Canada. And I started at a Microsoft partner. I was actually at a Microsoft partner for about 9 years, a solutions partner. Mm-hmm. And, we built things basically that partners would build. But one of the great projects that we got to build at that partner was I designed and we built the first digital library for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind.
Oh, wow.
Now, yeah, this was back in like 2002 or 2003. And, accessibility was always important. It always just seemed to make sense. But I still had a compliance mindset kind of going into that project. And when you worked with the stakeholders at the CNIB and their customers and all of that, you kind of quickly pivot to this idea of, I'm designing for these folks. They're my customers. So it brings up all kinds of really interesting sort of notions of design. A lot of people think of the disabled as like the edges, I guess, the atypical.
Right.
But the thing that you realize when you're designing is that as a designer or as, any sort of person who's putting together a solution, you pick who's on the margins because you pick where the center is. And so what I mean by that is I designed a website that was for the blind and it was meant for them. And what ended up happening, not in a bad way, but it wasn't necessarily for the sighted, right? Okay. So I marginalized people with typical vision, people who, and this was 2003. So, websites weren't that sophisticated. So we optimized a website for a blind and low vision crowd, and that meant that it wasn't optimized for a sighted crowd. So it's an interesting perspective, right? Like as someone who makes something, you pick the edges because you pick where you're targeting. You pick the center.
Right. I watched an interview with you this morning, actually.
Cool.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you said something that was really, really interesting to me. And it sort of shifted my thoughts around disability. And the discussion was around that if a person with a wheelchair goes into a building and they can't get upstairs, that's not a problem with the person with the wheelchair. That's a problem in the design of the building because they didn't design for someone in a wheelchair to go upstairs. And I can't remember the term that you used, but it was really interesting to me because it made me think about exactly that. When we design something, we're designing with maybe a specific person in mind, and we're not thinking about all of the other people that aren't sort of the atypical, and I don't even like to use that word, but atypical abilities. And it was just super interesting to me.
Yeah, and I mean that's that idea. I mean, there's a number of names for it. I think the most common one is the idea of the social model of disability.
That's it. Yeah.
And that comes from the World Health Organization. Well, sorry, I don't know if that's where it comes from, but that's where we first heard about it. In 2014, the World Health Organization redefined its definition of disability from an individual health condition to a mismatch in interactions between a person and their environment. And that's what leads to the social model of disability. It's not the only model of disability. I don't want to sort of say that it's the best. I think the one thing that I constantly come back to in this work is that I'm literally in the business of special treatment, so I don't really have to pick a best.
Right.
There are lots of models of disability, but the social model is a good one for product makers because it puts the responsibility on you. And just sort of what I just talked about, like you're picking the center. And if that archetype of what you're trying to design for happens to be you, then you have to kind of recognize what that means. I think we don't have the luxury anymore of design being this like kind of artistic ideal of like the creator inventing something from like, we have much more responsibility than that, especially at the scale that we work at. So it's really important for us as a practice to always intentionally include people with disabilities in the product making process. Because if we don't, we will unintentionally exclude them, which is what the social model of disability is about, right? Like I'm an architect and I have legs and I designed my building with stairs because I didn't think about wheelchairs because I don't have a wheelchair.
Right.
But you have to think about people who use wheelchairs.
Right. So let's talk about the most tearjerker Super Bowl commercial I think I have ever seen. And that is around the adaptive Xbox controller, which you are a co-inventor of. How did that come to be? I know you've talked about that lots of times.
The commercial?
No, the controller itself.
Oh, the controller.
The commercial I get. Yeah.
Well, the commercial's actually got some fun stories in it too. But the controller came about because we were looking at accessibility for Xbox. I was working at Xbox at the time. I always cared about accessibility, but at around 2013 with the launch of the generation of PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, there was some legal accessibility compliance in the US that was going to start applying to consoles. And so we started to look at it, and I've always had a history with accessibility, so I was super into this idea of gaming accessibility at the time. And then the lobbyists that sort of represent the video game industry lobbied the FCC and said, "Listen, this is a console launch year. You can't do this to us this year. It would be too disruptive." And so there was an extension placed on the console industry for 2 years. And so, I went and did other stuff for a while. There's always lots to do. But around 2015, we came back. We started working on accessibility for the console, things like screen readers and better closed captioning and magnifiers and controller remapping. And all of those were to meet a legal compliance. But as we were doing all this, we recognized that there was this one big challenge, was that the actual controller, the thing that you use to use a console, made a lot of assumptions about how people used it. That whole bias thing that we were just sort of talking about. It assumes that you have two hands to hold it, that you have two thumbs for the thumbsticks, that you have a fluid range of motion, that you have the dexterity and the endurance to hold it, and the dexterity to use all the buttons. And so, and to use it in a very prescriptive way. And so we had to recognize that when people couldn't use our controller, we created the controller. So we were creating the disability according to the social model of disability, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, this was all around the same time we were thinking about a lot of these themes. So at the hackathon in 2015, Microsoft has a huge annual hackathon every year. We started looking at how we could make a modular controller. We partnered with a charity called Warfighter Engaged, and we met some people that they worked with. And they were vets. So the fun thing about the Super Bowl ad is most people know about the controller because of the Super Bowl ad, and they're like, right. It's great that you did that for these kids. And I was like, oh, we didn't work for kids. We started with vets.
Right.
our whole and I will say too that it was because we started with vets that I really genuinely feel like the project got off the ground. It was a time when a lot of these ideas were really new, even at Microsoft. And so you couldn't really go up to someone, especially in Xbox, and go, hey, our beloved game controller, it's the problem.
Right.
Right. Like they just couldn't wrap their heads around it, something that they used all day long. So when you bring in vets, who are injured in service or have other injuries, and it's hard enough for a vet to integrate back into society. And the thing about vets is that anyone who's been in service for the past 10 years grew up playing video games. They all play video games when they're deployed. It's a huge part of their social life. So when they come home and they're injured and they can't play video games, they're even more isolated than veterans tend to be already. So all of these things kind of combine together. And then you have veterans on our teams at Microsoft. It just becomes a really kind of a no-brainer story. It's like, well, we have to do this. How do we not do this? And so, it's still, I will say, it was still a very unusual project. And we had a dedicated group of individuals and a leadership team that was very forgiving because we kind of just kept working on it. Right. And they didn't get it. And I don't want to blame anybody for not getting it. It was, like I said, it was kind of a different time. But we kept working on it. We kept plugging away, and eventually the controller came out, and we were all thrilled, I think, at the reception of it. But we certainly learned a lot, I think. And I think to this day, there's lessons we learned from the adaptive controller that I don't know if we have answers to.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really funny, right? Like, I don't know if you want to get into that whole thing.
I'd be interested. Yeah, no, I would be super interested in that.
So, like, if I gave you a hammer, there's this term in product making and psychology called functional fixedness, right? Okay. And what it means is that the form of an object has like an understanding, like in people's minds, and then. And, when you tell them it's something different, like it's hard for them to wrap their heads around it. Like if I gave you a hammer and said it was a can opener, you'd be like, no, it isn't. And I'm like, watch me open this can with this hammer. Right. Right. So the thing about a game controller is that it is so pervasive in our culture. Right. That when you come out with something like the adaptive controller that doesn't really have a fixed form by design, there are certainly the vast majority of people don't necessarily understand it. Right. And the thing that we learned was that even people who couldn't use a typical controller didn't understand it. Right. And because you don't think about, it's really hard to think about how to accomplish something unless you're really intentional about it when you don't have the ability. So what I mean by that is, let me give you another vet example, because this will probably help. So if a vet loses a limb in service, they will show up and they'll talk to us and they'll go, I need a one-handed controller. And we'll be like, why? And they're like, well, I only got one hand. And we have to ask them to stop telling us what they're missing and tell us what they've got. Right?
Okay.
Like, can you move your feet? Can you move your like knees, your head? Can you bite on things? Right? Like, so when you get a vet that comes within one hand, they think that because game controllers are this, they think they need to do everything that they can do with this with just one of these. And they forget that they have feet and they forget they have other body parts. And this happens like all the time with people with injury. So you've got with people who acquire a disability through injury, you have to retrain them.
Right.
Now, there's another side of this coin where you could be born with a disability like cerebral palsy. And we would meet people who would just be like, well, I never thought about this because I couldn't do this. So I figured gaming wasn't for me. So they already so all of this stuff around like popular culture,
right,
and how objects are in our society, like makes it so that people think that when I give them a toolkit like the adaptive controller or even our new Microsoft adaptive accessories, they have to really kind of like think about what they can move and how they move it, and what they can kind of do, because it becomes, it becomes really fixed in their minds. I think like another example of this, and I'll go through this one quickly. I work with a lot of people who've been here at Microsoft for 25 or 30 years. They have carpal tunnel because they've been on mice and keyboards for 25 or 30 years. They go see a therapist and their therapist tells them, hey, you can't use a mouse or keyboard anymore because your carpal tunnel is really bad. So you need to start using your voice to use a computer. And do you think those people actually go and use their voice to use a computer, or do you think that they just sort of suffer through the pain and ration their time?
I know, because I'm married to someone who has exactly that issue.
Right.
And my husband used, I think it was called Dragon software at the time.
Yeah.
But I think even through all of that, and it was a nerve surgery that he had, I think even through all of that, the gut reaction was to attempt to use his mouse anyway, even if he used the other hand to use his mouse. So now we're transferring the issue from one hand to another hand. Yeah. And so I think people don't until there's no other option. Until
there's no other option. I will say, though, that it is completely natural to want to do that. So I definitely like to sit in that space of like, listen, I know you want to use your keyboard and mouse, maybe I can do something like one of the things that we always tell people with the adaptive accessories, and even before that with a bunch of other things, you can get these foot pedals off Amazon that are like plug into USB ports. So you could do like Control, Alt, Shift, maybe Windows, and use your feet. Really? Like for those keys that you press a lot, like modifier keys. Right. You could do that, or you could change the sensitivity of the mouse. You could put all these buttons that are on the sides of mice that no one really ever uses. You could start to leverage those. So we really are trying to figure out how to get people to change their mindset about how they use things. I mean, I work with like some of the greatest ergonomists in the world, but they tell you how to not get carpal tunnel. They don't necessarily tell you what to do once you've got it. Right. Right. So it's tricky.
Right. Can we talk about the adaptive kit for a little bit? Because again, I think that's something that most people aren't familiar with.
The accessories or the kit?
Both, but the accessories first, I would say.
I know we have names that are all very familiar or similar. So yeah, the adaptive accessories was us taking what we learned from the adaptive controller. And then there was a colleague of mine who has a daughter with cerebral palsy. His name is John Helms. And he did a hackathon project about creating an adaptive mouse. And, his project was really cool. We started to kind of play with it. It was another hackathon project. This was around 2020, in the summer of 2020. And he had these really good ideas. We started talking about all these things that I've learned since the the adaptive controller. And I will say, like, John basically hooked up with, like, it was like started this project, and the adaptive controller team kind of like joined him, right?
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like, we had these new adaptive accessories, which consist of a mouse, a switch hub, and then a custom button. And we took what we learned from the adaptive controller and we applied it to productivity. And we did a bunch of things that we couldn't do with the adaptive controller. There's a lot of business rules around things like macros in gaming. Like, even though someone with a disability would really benefit from the ability to use a macro, there are certain parts of the business that think that might be cheating for someone who doesn't have a disability. So it's a very, it's a charged topic. We actually go back and forth a lot. There's a lot of people out there, it's kind of like security and usability, like, people like security, right. And it's like, I can't even get into my thing.
Right.
It's so secure. Right. We go back and forth, but with the adaptive accessories, because it was a PC device, we could do macros. We don't have those limitations, those kind of business limitations. There's lots of things on PCs that do macros. So all of a sudden you can start to look at how do you create a system to empower people to be more productive. So we were looking at this was inspired by John's daughter who has cerebral palsy. And so we would look at a mouse. And the other thing that John was really into is he was really into 3D printing. So it became a really important part of the project of how to sort of augment these devices through 3D printing. So whereas the adaptive controller, you plug a lot of stuff into it, but it would kind of be its own base. Like, we would see people 3D print stuff and glue it to the adaptive controller. And so we decided to create a system with the new ones, with the adaptive accessories, to give people like a better way of doing that, like instead of just like gluing stuff.
Right.
I mean, you have to respect that in that community. I do often say that my biggest competitors are duct tape and cardboard.
Right. Twist ties and yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that, and I have mixed opinions on this, COVID was terrible in a lot of ways, but what COVID taught us as business professionals was that people could work from home, and they could work from home very productively. Yeah. And I haven't seen any data around this, but I wonder if that hasn't positively impacted the disability community, because I think it's probably a little bit easier to provide adaptations that people can use in their homes, whereas trying to, say you have an individual who's blind, mm-hmm. providing those adaptations in a small office like ours might be a little bit more challenging. Whereas if they have the ability to work from home now, I wonder if the employment opportunities haven't gotten any better as a result of that.
I mean, I would definitely say that the consensus is absolutely. Right. I mean, there's been tons of articles about that example that you described. There was a really great, I think it was Fast Company or something like that, where some woman talked about how, she can't have a 50-inch screen for her low vision on her desk at work, but she can in her house. Right. And that makes her a lot more productive. And a lot of accommodations like that about setting up environment. I think that's completely true. There's obviously, not having to commute is a huge deal. Commuting is a big deal when you're disabled. Sure. And so I definitely know of a lot of experts in that field of employment data for the disabled that would say that it had a very positive effect. And I mean, currently right now, if you look at the labor numbers, right, we're at a level of disabled employment that we've never seen. So we started tracking in the U.S. disabled employment data in 2008. It fell, obviously, when the pandemic happened, everyone lost their jobs, everything fell through the floor. But for a long time, the disabled community was actually growing at a faster rate than the non-disabled community. Really? Yeah, I can send you that data if you want to see it.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty It's pretty amazing. The reason why I'm sort of like humming and hawing here, though, is that, while so many people and experts say that, oh yeah, working from home, really did it for people. We all also, when we see people with disabilities out in the workforce, we see the types of jobs they often have, right? And
Right.
and there another thing that happened during the pandemic, the whole Great Resignation thing, right? A lot of people quit jobs that
Right.
they didn't feel were fulfilling or worth their time. And it was, and this is another bit of speculation, but I have seen some data to pick this up a bit. Employers became a lot more willing to hire people with disabilities because they were hurting for staff.
Sure.
So, they were, whereas something they might not have considered before, they were considering. So I wonder how many people during the Great Resignation quit their jobs, and how many people with disabilities snapped them up.
Right.
Because when you look at the sectors that have grown the most post-pandemic, and I wish there was newer data. I just saw, the last time I saw it, I think the data was 2021, so we were kind of still in the middle of it. But it wasn't office work that was picking up. It was like hospitality and things like that.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I wish I could get newer data. I do. I must admit, I look for this stuff a lot.
Yeah.
Because I do want to kind of understand. I mean, PBS just did a really great sort of a video post on how, what do they call them? Like personal care workers. I can't remember the disabled. I don't know. They have a different acronym that PBS used, but they're like basically like care workers. Like, we can just be broader, right?
In-home care,
whether it's for the elderly, whether you're like a job coach or a job developer for like someone who in supported employment, or whether you're, you work in like a home, like a living facility. That's like the biggest employment sector in the U.S. And it's not doing great because they don't. I mean, that was another thing. Anecdotally, I hear a lot from job coaches. I've been dealing with a lot of supported employment lately. I've been digging in there.
Right.
And so anecdotally, job coaches and these care workers tend to make $15-16 an hour around there. And they're like, I could go get that at McDonald's and have a lot less stress.
Yeah. I mean, I've run into that a lot in my role as a board member with various organizations, but it's exactly that. It's that you want in-home care workers, but you can't compete with the Walmarts and the Targets and the McDonald's with the base salary. And it's unfortunate because the skills required are critical,
Right.
And, but I understand. I mean, people need to feed their families, it's.
Totally. Yeah, no. And I talk with a lot of job coaches, which is, for those who don't know what a job coach is, supported employment in the U.S. is for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. So the government will help fund positions for people who meet that criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And, they typically get hired through a supported employment agency, and then they get a job coach. So, they go work at Panera Bread and they do stuff at Panera Bread, but their job coach shows up every once in a while to support them.
Right.
And so job coaches are spread really thin right now because of all this. And so I'm looking at trying to figure out how do we just make this whole system, I think, through technology. I mean, I'm at Microsoft. We're thinking a lot about AI right now. Yeah. So how do we actually take something that's very traditionally really hands-on and not take away the good parts of the hands-onness, but how do we use technology to get rid of some of the monotony of the work? The Department of Vocational Rehabilitation asks for a lot of forms.
Paperwork, right?
Paperwork, right?
Right.
So how do we get rid of some of that monotony so that people can actually focus on supporting people?
Right.
That's a fun little exploration we're doing right now, hopefully.
Yeah. So I'd love to dig into that. I do want to talk about the Inclusive Tech Lab because I think that's one of the coolest things I think I've ever seen. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do there?
Yeah. So while we were working on the adaptive controller, and I mentioned sort of before how our colleagues didn't get that people couldn't use a regular controller. They just didn't have it, and they just couldn't get past that block in their brain. So we first started buying basically like a lot of specialized game controllers, things that were pretty expensive, very finicky, and we would basically show up in like a lobby of a building or like the cafeteria, and we'd set up a couple consoles and we'd ask people to like play with these controllers, right? These odd ones. And we'd show pictures of how people would use things like that. It was sort of the first sort of attempts at trying to like get people into it.
Right.
And as we started to do that, we quickly kind of realized that like showing videos or photos or slide decks in a meeting room, like you're like some kind of researcher, just wasn't really cutting it in the way that we wanted it to. It wasn't visceral. People weren't, it was very academic. Like people are showing up and going, well, okay, what am I learning about now? And they thought of it like training. So we created the first version of the Inclusive Tech Lab to be a space where you can come and be immersed in this whole notion. And we did created it first to explain or to like really dive into how people who use non-traditional controllers play. Because we were in Xbox, and that was kind of what we were working on. We were in the middle of the development of the adaptive controller when all this was happening. We basically just needed a place to demonstrate what we were trying to do with the adaptive controller. And we started to do other things. We quickly branched out into a bunch of other sort of areas. One of the kind of big branching out in the early on was we looked at a sensory room. Sometimes people call it snoozling room. Because we would hear stories of like neurodiverse kids transitioning from school to home and having a rough transition from school to home, and the types of things that they would do to kind of achieve balance felt extreme. So we knew sensory rooms were used for that. So we just looked at like, well, what could we kind of do? I will say, I mean, we have a sensory room in our latest Inclusive Tech Lab. It's always the biggest hit. Like everyone loves a sensory room. But I'm still sort of playing with many ideas. I don't like, I'm not ever suggesting that there's going to be like a Microsoft sensory room kit. I'm not a therapist, right? I don't practice therapy. So even our sensory room, there's certain things like I stay away from that I know, like, sometimes therapists come in and they go, you should have this, you should have this, you should have this. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I'm not a therapist. Right. So I'm not going to practice on anybody. Right. So ours is very a sensory room light. But yeah, the Inclusive Tech Lab has evolved in about just almost 2 years now. We opened up a new one. Brand new build, everything kind of done. We expanded our charter to other to Surface, basically, and education. So we look at a lot of PC things and Windows and all that kind of stuff. And we bring people in. I think that the biggest part of the evolution from the first lab to the second one, the motivations for the first lab was to get our colleagues to care about accessibility. And the motivation for the second lab, as part of this evolution of the second lab, was to basically be like, this is the home of the disability community on campus. Right. Like, we're a big corporate campus. This is their place. Like that. I mean, it can be argued whether or not we achieve this goal. Right. But we needed to say, no, when our colleagues come here and interact with the disability community, our colleagues are visiting. This is their house. Right. And that was the goal. So we wanted to make the room as accessible as possible. And we really try to live up to that ideal of nothing about us without us, because we have this space. Like, that's why we have the space. And it's funny, I sometimes get people and they go, well, what is this for? And I go, well, I bring in the disability community and we interact in here and you know, like, and they go, well, give me an example. And I'll be like, well, I kicked out Walmart once for a transition program to come in. Right. So, like, you know, like, so like we host a lot of customers, we show them what we're doing, but like, you know, as part of this supported employment and education journey that we've been on recently, and that's just one of many journeys. We have lots of kind of things that we're looking at all the time. We host a lot of local transition programs for neurodiverse students, just sort of between high school and a job, right? They have these programs called transition programs. They happen all across the states. But we host those folks all the time. And recently we actually had a return visitor. We had a program come back for a second time with the same students. So we had to kind of up our game. Like, it wasn't just like, hey, hang out in this cool room and listen to us, you know, ask you questions. They were like, no, we're going to come and you're going to teach us something. So we showed them Copilot, which was, this was like a couple months ago. And we showed them how they could take a job description that they'd found online and ask Copilot to help them write a cover letter for that job position. Right. And they were pretty happy with it because, you know, it gave them something it gave them a way to think about how to use AI in a real productive way. You know, because all these kids in these programs are like, they're all trying to build their resumes. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And it's hard, right? Because they're especially in transition programs in particular. It's really tricky.
Right. I work with a nonprofit here locally that provides internships for individuals with developmental disabilities, and that can be neurodiverse. It can be all kinds of stuff. Nice. And the goal is to transition them from graduating high school into some sort of employment and potentially college. You know, it just depends. Yeah. And the statistics around individuals in Virginia that are unemployed with intellectual disability, developmental disabilities, really are staggering. It's like 80%. I mean, it's unbelievable. So to have technologies like Copilot that can help them, and it's not that Copilot is writing the cover letter for them. It's helping them work through that process. Right.
Yeah, and that's really what we showed them. And it's interesting, right? Because the students that we were working with, they also had internships. So we just showed them, like, we put in the job description of a job that we just found at a grocery store. It was in the bakery, I think. So we just pasted that into Copilot, and then we would ask the students questions. Well, tell me about what you do at your job. Right. And we would enter all that into Copilot, and we'd say, okay, Copilot, you've got all this now. Now write a cover letter. You know,
I love it.
Yeah, it was great.
I love it.
Works
yes.
well.
So can we dig in just a little bit more? And I know we're running down on time. I want to be respectful of your time, but can we dig in a little bit on how you see AI impacting the work that you're doing and you know, where that could potentially go?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, it's funny, you know, I think when I started, you know, when everyone got on ChatGPT a year ago,
right?
Like, yeah, I was a little skeptical and I made some mistakes, but man, it really does change a lot of things.
Right.
And it's hard to even imagine how I worked before.
Right.
Personally.
Right.
And so, you know, the potential is really there to really be transformative. And I must admit, it's super exciting. There's a lot to kind of do there, and beyond just like a large language model kind of ChatGPT kind of AI. You know, there's so much happening in terms of like what we can do now with like you know, gesture and body recognition and vocalization and all that sort of fun stuff that really can empower, I think, people with disabilities. But all of it being backed up by like a large language model. that information is what's really interesting. I mean, one of the things, you work with all these nonprofits. I'm sure you talk to people. I think one of the things that people don't really realize is how much paperwork's involved in just being disabled, just existing, right?
Yeah.
And so, you'll hear from people and they'll be like, oh yeah, me filling out forms is a full-time job. So I think that's a really exciting kind of opportunity for a real tangible one that could not only really super empower the disabled, but make things better for everybody. Is just this idea of, just having these personal language models of your information that will help you like fill out the monotony of like what your life is. Right. And how do you go about that? So, I mean, I will say that I think that's a real sweet spot for us as Microsoft, because, we certainly spend a lot of time on making sure your data is secure and private. So we can put that data in a place where you have access to it, but no one else does, right? Like, how do you start leveraging your own data? I think in the ways that I think, people might skeptically say big tech's been doing for a long time. So yeah, I think that's super powerful. I mean, again, like, just like with the adaptive controller, and just like when it's brand new, right? So I think a lot about that notion of intuitiveness, right?
Right.
Because when I talk to people about work, and I talk to people about process, everyone goes, well, I just want it to be easy, like an app like Spotify. And I'm like, I'd argue that Spotify, I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack with that.
Right.
I mean, what they want is what they want. I'm not going to argue that.
Right.
But they don't necessarily realize like the motivation they have for using Spotify, right? Like, I want to hear music. Okay, well, that's something fun to do. That's not work. Right. So you're gonna have a little bit more motivation to do that. And I think people who think something's intuitive, they don't recognize that they had to learn it and now it's familiar to them.
Right.
And so I think about that way too much, to be honest. There's this classic Jeff Raskin. Jeff Raskin was one of the original designers of Mac OS. And he wrote this essay that basically says when people say intuitive, what they mean is familiar.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, 30 years ago.
Right.
So that's why, like, you have people who are like, well, I'm an Android person or I'm an iPhone person, right? Like, because it's like, no, my brain's wired to this, right? This is intuitive. This isn't. And it's that familiarity that we're all trying to kind of leverage. And the reason why I think about this so often is that is trying to achieve this balance between empowering someone with a disability who has a really unique need and not making it too unfamiliar.
Right.
So I can think of dozens of examples of assistive technology that are really empowering, but they're just too much of a head scratcher, I think, for people to kind of like get around them. Like they require too much of a mental leap. And I mean, I'm guilty of that too. I will definitely admit that, when in that balance of like power versus like simplicity, I lean towards power. Right. The entire disability assistive technology industry leads towards power, because we have so many people to empower. Right. So, you make those trade-offs. I mean, the other thing about it is that when you're trying to make something simple, you're going to focus down on someone on a very specific use case. So when people would come up to me and they would talk about the adaptive controller and they would say things like, this is great, but if you just did this, this, and this, it would be so much more accessible. What they don't realize 99% of the time, they're saying, if you did these three things, it would be more accessible for me. and they
Right.
have no concept, understandably, of how pushing in one direction pushes away from another direction.
Right.
So like they don't have these concepts of like, well, if we go in this direction, it's going to be great for me, but who am I going to be excluding by heading in one direction over another? So with our products and what we've tried to do, we definitely, we try to achieve these balances. We think about them a lot. But I also recognize like that, those choices are choices we make, and there have been newer products that have made other choices, and I applaud those choices.
Right. 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 Yeah. Achieving that balance has got to be really, really difficult. I can't imagine the A/B testing and things that you go through on everything,
Yeah. It's funny, people think that we do that a lot, and we don't really.
Really.
Yeah. Because don't get me wrong. All that stuff is multivariate testing is super important, but let's talk about cerebral palsy for a minute.
Okay.
Right. Cerebral palsy exhibits itself in a number of different ways, right? There's similarities, but when you mix it all together, everybody's different. We like to say that if you've met one person with cerebral palsy, you've met one person with cerebral palsy. So I think in traditional product development, people would go, well, I'm going to come up with version A, B, and C.
Right.
And I'm going to go out to my user group, and I'm going to ask my user group of like 7 people with cerebral palsy, which one do you want, A, B, or C? And the trick that we see with a lot of this stuff, especially with like this CP example, is let's say 4 people choose A, 2 people choose B, and 1 person chooses C out of the 7. Traditional product development would be like, oh, well, A. Right. But, you're eliminating 3/7 of the group. You're saying 3/7 of the group are not going to be able to use this thing. That's a big number.
Right.
Right. And the thing is that when you're talking about something like cerebral palsy, that person that picks C, that's just one, it might really empower them in many more ways. Like maybe the 4 that picked A don't really have the same type of barriers in their lives that the person who like picked C, the one person who picked C has. So you have to think about not only the reach, but the impact of like what's happening in someone's experience. And then so we take those results, we do those prototypes, we do that type of work, but we don't use these quantitative methods to narrow it down, if you will.
Right.
If anything, what we would do is we would look at A, B, and C and go, okay, what's D? How do we take the best of A, B, and C and make D? And then D, E, and F, or whatever.
Right.
And so. And I don't want to pretend like it's always that pure, but I mean that is the thought process. Like I'm not trying to like basically come up with like something that's perfect. I think that's another thing that's coming up a lot in our work lately too. You ever heard the expression perfect is the enemy of done?
Yes. Yes, I live that with our graphic designers specifically.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm a designer, so yeah, I get it.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
But it's true, right? Like, the adaptive controller took 3 years to make. I'm 51 years old. I sit here every day and go, how many of these do I have left?
Right.
Like I literally count, like I literally wake up in the morning and go like, how many adaptive controllers do I have left?
Yeah. Well, at some point you're going to be designing for you in your 75, 80, 85,
Yeah.
I mean.
Well, and it's funny you say that because that's actually like, that's stuff that we do right now in many ways, because we as in the same way that we're trying to look at the interrelated needs of disability and try to get as broad a group of disabled folks as we can. One of our core principles of our inclusive design methodology is to go, well, how is this better for everybody?
Right.
So that's always the hope, right? I think what's odd is how it doesn't matter how much we always kind of have to go back to these fundamentals, because everyone's tech changes all the time, and people forget. They're like, oh, new thing, and then they things
Right.
that they used to be really good at, they might forget.
Right.
And
Right.
so there's a lot of fundamentals that we're always kind of training people on.
Right.
You know?
Right. 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 I think you have never-ending work ahead of you, to be quite honest. Not to scare you or anything, but that's
No,
what I think.
mean, I think that interrelated need of disability is really interesting. But yeah, I mean, that work with the work that you've done with the IDD community, that one's a big one for me, because
Right.
it just feels like, I was at this event, this like county event for National Disability Employment Awareness Month,
Right.
in December, and they awarded like the supported employee of the year, and they talked about his determination about getting a job that he never thought he'd have, and how hard he worked at it, and how his employer thought he was the best at it, and he'd cover other people's shifts, and no one ever thought he could do it, but he worked really hard to get it. And that job was being a cashier. And it was a great story. It's a wonderful story.
Wow.
And I couldn't help but just sit there in the audience going, but we're trying to get rid of cashiers. Like,
Right.
like as a
Right. Right.
as retail evolves, like the
Right.
need for cashiers is going like away. And so I really am sitting here going like, well, the jobs that we're training people with intellectual disabilities to get are going to change. Like, and this is my bias perhaps, but I don't think any job in the future is going to not have tech in it.
Oh, I agree.
So,
yeah, I'm with you 100%. Yes.
So like, I mean, how do we make sure that all of this tech is accessible? Because especially in employment, I think, and I'm not trying to point any fingers, but I think some of the most confusing things in enterprise technology is the business rules that are set up by the businesses,
Right.
not necessarily the technology.
Right. Yes, I agree. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been, I love chatting with you because it's always so interesting. I could talk to you all day, honestly. It's always so interesting. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to do some digging into the data around how the pandemic potentially did and did not impact the disability community with jobs, because I'm super interested in
I'll send you some, and I'll send you some, and I know the sector data is the stuff that's hard to get. I'm trying to find it too.
Right. If I come across any, I will let you know also.
Yeah,
but thank you. I really appreciate it, and it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.